In the past 5 years, rent has risen faster than wages in almost every major economy on Earth. In the United States, median rent for a single-family home has climbed nearly 40% since 2020. In the United Kingdom, average private rents hit record highs for 3 consecutive years. In Dublin,
In Berlin,
in Sydney, in Toronto,
in Amsterdam,
in Lisbon, the same story told in different currencies. Rents rising, wages lagging, a generation priced out of the city they were born in. You already know this. You live it or someone you love lives it. The rent notice that arrives each year with the same bad news. The negotiation you can't win. The apartment viewing with 40 other people. The landlord who raised the rent by 15% because, as he put it, the market had moved. But here is the question almost no one asks. Why? Why, specifically, does rent never stop rising? Why, in year after year, decade after decade, in country after country, does the cost of having a roof over your head outpace almost every other cost in your life? The easy answer, the one politicians prefer, is that there simply aren't enough homes. Build more, they say, and rents will fall. It is a comforting story because it implies the problem is mechanical. Supply is too low. Fix the supply. Problem solved. But it isn't true. Or rather, it is only a small part of the truth. Because if the problem were only supply, we would expect rent to rise and fall with construction. We would expect rents in cities with huge construction booms to fall when all those new apartments came online. Sometimes they do, briefly, but the long-term direction is always up. This is because rent is not like other prices. The cost of a loaf of bread is set by bakers and farmers competing with each other. The cost of a car is set by manufacturers competing with each other. The cost of shelter in most rich countries today is increasingly not set by a market at all. It is set by software, by algorithms, by global asset managers who own tens of thousands of homes and treat them not as places to live but as income-producing instruments, like bonds that bleed cash. Over the next 60 minutes, we are going to follow the trail. We will start with the numbers. Then we will trace how, in the years after 2008, the world's largest investment funds quietly became landlords on a scale history has never seen. We will look at the pricing algorithms that now set rent for millions of apartments simultaneously. We will walk through the laws that let institutional landlords raise rent with impunity, the tax rules that reward empty homes, the zoning codes that freeze supply in amber, and the short-term rental boom that quietly pulled millions of homes out of the long-term rental market. And then, at the end, we will look at the handful of places that have pushed back, and what their experience tells us about whether rent can be stopped. This is the paper trail, and this is why rent never stops rising. Let's start with the scale. In the United States, the median asking rent for a 3-bedroom single-family home stood at around $2,100 a month in 2025. 5 years earlier, that same figure was closer to $1,500, a rise of nearly 40% in half a decade. Over the same period, median household income grew by roughly 23%. Do the arithmetic. Rent moved almost twice as fast as pay. This is not evenly distributed. In cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Boston, a household now needs to earn well over $100,000 a year to comfortably afford a median 3-bedroom rental. By the classic threshold economists use, spending no more than 30% of pre-tax income on rent, over 20 million American households are now rent-burdened. Around 10 million spend more than half their income on rent. In the United Kingdom, the Office for National Statistics reported that average private rents rose by over 9% in a single year at the peak of the recent crisis, the fastest annual increase since records began. London rents rose even faster. A 1-bedroom flat in Zone 2, which in 2014 might have rented for £1,200 a month, was by 2024 routinely listed for £2,000 or more. A 60% increase over a decade in which wages for most workers moved almost not at all. In Ireland, the housing situation is arguably worse. Dublin rents have now more than doubled since 2012. The average asking rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in the city centre sits at over €2,000 per month, higher than many neighbourhoods in central London. 20-somethings who grew up in Dublin find themselves commuting 2 hours from towns they've never lived in before, because that is the distance at which the rent becomes bearable. Canada tells a similar story. Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, all three saw rent increases that outpaced wages every year for over a decade. In Vancouver, the rent-to-income ratio is among the highest in the developed world. In Australia, Sydney rents have climbed so steeply that the city's own economic planning body describes the rental market as broken. In Amsterdam, Berlin, Lisbon, and Barcelona, the same pattern repeats. Rents racing ahead, wages walking behind. Here is a number you rarely see in the mainstream coverage. In the United States, the share of single-family rental homes owned by institutional investors rose from essentially zero before 2008 to approximately 5% by 2024. In parts of Atlanta, Phoenix, Jacksonville, and Charlotte, institutional investors own between 15 and 30% of all single-family rentals. In some individual zip codes, they own the majority, and they are still buying. In Europe, the concentration is different in form but similar in effect. Large asset management firms now own tens of thousands of apartments in major cities. One firm alone controls a real estate portfolio worth hundreds of billions of dollars, including more than 270,000 rental homes in the United States and tens of thousands more across Europe. Institutional ownership is not bad simply because it is institutional, but it has one defining characteristic. It operates under the logic of the capital market, not the logic of housing. And in a market where a small number of large owners dominate, returns can be engineered in ways a local landlord could never manage. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, because institutional landlords, working alongside a relatively small number of pricing software vendors, have spent the past decade and a half building an infrastructure that allows them to coordinate rent increases across markets. Not formally, not in smoke-filled rooms, but through software, through shared data, through algorithms that, it now appears, may have been doing something courts are willing to call illegal. And that is the story of the next section. In 2022, a journalist at ProPublica published an investigation that should have been front-page news in every major newspaper in the world. The headline was, "Rent Going Up? One company's algorithm could be why." The company was called RealPage. It was a Texas-based property management software firm. And its product, a tool called YieldStar, was used by landlords managing millions of apartments across the United States to set their rents. Here is how it worked. A landlord would subscribe to YieldStar. The software would then pull in data from all the other subscribing landlords in the same market: vacancy rates, lease renewal rates, current asking rents, the pace at which apartments were being snapped up. It would then use that data to recommend a rent for each unit. Not just a market rate, a maximized rate. A rate calibrated to extract the highest possible rent while keeping vacancies below a certain threshold. The key insight, and the legally problematic one, is that the data was shared. Landlords who were nominally competitors were feeding their pricing data into the same system and receiving recommendations based on that pooled information. In antitrust law, this is called a hub-and-spoke conspiracy. The landlords are the spokes. RealPage is the hub. And the effect, according to the Department of Justice and a growing number of state attorneys general, was that rents rose faster in markets dominated by RealPage users than in comparable markets where the software was not used. How much faster? The ProPublica investigation found that in some markets, rents had risen by as much as 25% in 11 months. A former RealPage employee told the reporters that the company's own staff had raised concerns internally about whether the software was legal. The response, he said, was that the algorithm was serving the greater good, that it was better for everyone to succeed together than to compete against each other. That phrase, the greater good in everybody succeeding versus competing against one another, comes from a recorded presentation by a RealPage executive. It is, in the language of antitrust law, a confession. Competing against one another is exactly what the law requires. Coordinating to avoid competing is exactly what the law forbids. In August 2024, the Department of Justice, joined by 8 state attorneys general, filed a civil antitrust lawsuit against RealPage. The complaint alleged that the company had facilitated an illegal scheme to suppress competition among landlords and inflate rents for millions of American renters. The lawsuit named several of the largest property management companies in the United States as co-defendants. RealPage denied the allegations. The case is ongoing. But here is the important point. RealPage is not unique. It is one of several revenue management software companies operating in the rental market. Yurdi Matrix, CoStar,
Entrata.
all of them offer similar services. All of them aggregate data from competing landlords. All of them use that data to recommend rents. The RealPage lawsuit has shone a light on a practice that is, in various forms, industry-wide. And this practice has a name. It is called algorithmic collusion. And it is the mechanism by which the logic of the capital market has been applied at scale to the business of putting a roof over your head. Before we move on, it is worth sitting with the human cost of this for a moment. When an algorithm raises the rent on your apartment by 15%, you do not negotiate with a person. You negotiate with a number. The number was not set by someone who knows you or your circumstances. It was set by a system designed to extract the maximum amount of money from you that the market will bear. And if you cannot pay it, there is a queue of other people behind you who might. To understand how institutional investors came to own so many homes, you have to go back to 2008. When the US housing market collapsed, millions of American families lost their homes to foreclosure. At the peak of the crisis, more than 100,000 homes a month were entering foreclosure proceedings. Entire neighborhoods in Phoenix, Atlanta, Las Vegas, and Florida were emptying out. Prices fell by 30, 40, 50% in some markets. The human suffering was enormous, and into that suffering walked the private equity firms. Between 2011 and 2015, a small number of large investment firms, backed by pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and institutional capital from around the world, spent tens of billions of dollars buying up foreclosed single-family homes. They bought them at auction. They bought them in bulk from banks. They bought them street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood. The largest of these buyers was a company called Invitation Homes, which was backed by the private equity giant Blackstone. At its peak, Invitation Homes owned more than 80,000 single-family rental homes across the United States. It was the largest single-family landlord in American history. This was not, in itself, illegal. Distressed assets were available. Capital was cheap. Returns were attractive. The firms that bought were doing what capital does, moving toward yield. But the consequences for the communities they bought into were profound. When a large institutional landlord owns a significant share of the rental stock in a neighborhood, it does not compete on price in the way a local landlord does. It sets a floor. And because it is using algorithmic pricing software, it sets that floor in coordination with other large landlords who are using the same software. The result, in cities like Atlanta and Phoenix, was that rents in the most affected zip codes rose significantly faster than in comparable areas with lower institutional ownership. Researchers at the University of California found that a 1 percentage point increase in institutional ownership was associated with a roughly 1% increase in rents. In areas where institutional ownership was above 10%, the effect was larger. This is not a coincidence. It is the predictable outcome of applying the logic of asset management to the business of housing. When housing is an asset class, the goal is not to provide shelter at a price people can afford. The goal is to maximize the risk-adjusted return on capital. And the most reliable way to do that in a market with constrained supply is to raise rents. The story repeated itself in Europe. In Spain, Blackstone became the country's largest private landlord, owning tens of thousands of apartments. In Ireland, large real estate investment trusts bought up entire apartment blocks before they were even built, locking out individual buyers. In Germany, large corporate landlords like Vonovia and Deutsche Wohnen came to own hundreds of thousands of apartments in major cities. The common thread is not the firm or the country. It is the logic. Housing in the hands of institutional capital is managed for return. And return means rent. And rent means you. Institutional ownership and algorithmic pricing are the mechanisms. But they operate within a legal and regulatory framework that was designed, often deliberately, to make housing expensive. Let's start with tax. In the United States, the tax code treats residential rental property with extraordinary generosity. Landlords can deduct mortgage interest, property taxes, maintenance costs, and management fees from their taxable income. But the most powerful provision is depreciation. Under current law, a residential rental property can be depreciated over 27 and a half years. This means a landlord can deduct a fraction of the building's value from their taxable income every year, even as the property's actual market value rises. For a large institutional landlord with a portfolio of thousands of homes, this depreciation allowance generates enormous tax savings. It is, in effect, a subsidy from the public to the private landlord, a transfer of money from the tax base to the balance sheet of the asset manager. And it makes the business of owning rental property more profitable than it would otherwise be, which attracts more capital into the sector, which drives up prices. The United Kingdom has its own version of this story. For decades, buy-to-let landlords could deduct their mortgage interest from their rental income before calculating their tax bill. This made leveraged property investment extraordinarily attractive. A landlord could borrow at 4%, earn a rental yield of 5%, deduct the interest, and pay tax only on the slim margin, while the property itself appreciated in value, tax-free until sale. This system was partially reformed in 2017 when mortgage interest relief for individual landlords was phased out. But the reform came too late to undo the structural shift it had enabled. Between 1996, when the buy-to-let mortgage was invented in the UK, and 2017, the number of privately rented homes in England more than doubled. A generation of homeowners had been outcompeted by investors with access to cheap leverage and favorable tax treatment. Then there is zoning. In most American cities, the majority of residential land is zoned exclusively for single-family homes. This means that in large swathes of cities like Los Angeles, Seattle, and Minneapolis, it is illegal to build an apartment building. It is illegal to build a duplex. It is illegal, in many cases, to build anything other than a detached house on a single plot. This is not an accident. Single-family zoning was, in many American cities, explicitly designed to preserve the character of white, middle-class neighborhoods by preventing the construction of the kind of dense, affordable housing that lower-income families could afford. The racial history of American zoning is well documented, but its economic consequences persist regardless of original intent. When you cannot build apartments near jobs, the apartments that exist near jobs become extraordinarily valuable, and their rents rise accordingly. Europe has its own version of this problem. Planning systems in the UK, Ireland, and parts of continental Europe are slow, expensive, and often captured by existing homeowners who have a financial interest in preventing new supply. The result is the same: not enough homes where people need to live. And then there is the short-term rental market. Since Airbnb launched in 2008, the short-term rental market has grown from nothing to a global industry worth over $100 billion a year. In cities like Lisbon, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Edinburgh, the platform has transformed entire neighborhoods. Apartments that were once rented to local residents at €1,000 a month are now rented to tourists at €120 a night. The maths is not complicated. A landlord who can earn €26,000 a year from tourists has no rational incentive to rent to a local at €12,000. The result, in city after city, has been a dramatic reduction in the supply of long-term rental housing in the most desirable urban neighborhoods. Lisbon lost an estimated 20% of its long-term rental stock to short-term rentals in the decade after Airbnb arrived. Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Edinburgh have all seen similar effects. The homes are still there. They are just no longer available to the people who live in the city. There is one more structural factor that made all of this possible, and it is the one that is least often discussed in the context of rent. It is the decade and a half of near-zero interest rates that followed the 2008 financial crisis. When central banks cut interest rates to near zero and kept them there for over a decade, they were trying to stimulate economic activity. They largely succeeded, but they also, as a side effect, made every income-producing asset in the world more valuable. When the risk-free rate of return, the rate you can earn by simply holding government bonds, is close to zero, investors are forced to seek yield elsewhere. And one of the most reliable sources of yield, in a world of near-zero rates, is residential rental property. The logic is straightforward. If you can borrow at 2% and earn a rental yield of 4%, you are making money. If you can borrow at 2% and leverage that borrowing to buy $100 million of property, you are making a lot of money. And if the property itself is appreciating in value, which it was in most major cities, for most of the period between 2010 and 2022, you are making extraordinary returns. This is why the institutional takeover of the rental market happened when it did. It was not simply that private equity firms saw an opportunity in the foreclosure crisis of 2008. It was that the monetary conditions of the following decade made leveraged real estate investment the most attractive trade in the global economy. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and endowments poured capital into real estate because they had no choice. Their beneficiaries needed returns. Real estate delivered them. The consequence was a structural shift in who owns rental housing. Before 2008, the rental market in most countries was dominated by individual landlords, people who owned one or two properties and rented them out. After 2008, in the United States and increasingly in Europe, a significant share of the market shifted to institutional owners managing portfolios of thousands or tens of thousands of units. And when interest rates finally rose, as they did sharply from 2022 onward, the institutional landlords did not sell. They raised rents, because the logic of the capital market requires that returns be maintained. If your cost of capital goes up, your revenue has to go up too. And revenue for a landlord means rent. This is the trap. When money was cheap, institutional landlords bought. When money became expensive, they charged more. Either way, the renter pays. We have now looked at the numbers, the algorithms, the institutional investors, the tax rules, the zoning codes, the short-term rental market, and the cheap money era. Let me try to draw these threads together. What we have described is not a series of separate problems. It is a system in which housing, one of the most fundamental human needs, has been progressively transformed into a financial instrument. And like all financial instruments, it is managed for return. The system works like this. Cheap money and favorable tax treatment attract institutional capital into the rental market. Institutional capital, operating at scale, uses algorithmic pricing software to coordinate rent increases across markets. Algorithmic pricing raises rents faster than wages. Rising rents make rental property more valuable, attracting more institutional capital. Zoning rules and planning restrictions prevent new supply from meeting demand. Short-term rental platforms remove further supply from the long-term market. Governments, whose politicians are often homeowners and whose donors are often property developers, are structurally reluctant to intervene. The result is a system that is self-reinforcing. Rents rise. The assets that generate those rents become more valuable. More capital flows in. Rents rise further. And the people who pay are renters. Specifically, they are young people, lower-income people, and people who live in cities, the very people who are most economically productive, most socially mobile, and most in need of stable, affordable housing. There is a phrase that economists use for this kind of dynamic. They call it a rent-seeking economy. Not rent in the sense of the money you pay your landlord. Rent in the economic sense, the extraction of value from an asset without creating new value. When a landlord raises your rent because the algorithm told them to, they are not building anything new. They are not providing a better service. They are extracting more money from you because the system allows them to. This is the paper trail, not a conspiracy, not a villain in a dark room. A system, a set of rules, incentives, and technologies that, taken together, produce a predictable outcome. Rent that never stops rising. Given everything we have described, what could actually change? Let me be honest with you. There is no single policy that will fix this. The system we have described was built over decades, through hundreds of individual decisions about tax, zoning, planning, monetary policy, and regulation. It will not be undone by a single election or a single piece of legislation. But there are things that work. We know this because some places have tried them. Vienna is the most frequently cited example. The Austrian capital has maintained a massive stock of publicly owned and subsidized housing for over a century. Today, roughly 60% of Vienna's residents live in some form of subsidized housing. The city owns around 220,000 apartments and subsidizes hundreds of thousands more through a cooperative model. Rents in the public sector are capped at a fraction of market rates. And because the public sector is so large, it acts as a ceiling on the private sector too. Private landlords cannot charge whatever they like because their tenants have a credible alternative. Vienna is not perfect, Its model took generations to build and requires sustained political will and public investment to maintain. But it demonstrates something important: that housing can be treated as infrastructure rather than as an investment, and that when it is, rents stay affordable. Berlin tried a different approach. In 2020, the city introduced the Mietendeckel, the rent cap, which froze rents for 5 years. The policy was popular with tenants and deeply unpopular with landlords. In 2021, Germany's constitutional court struck it down, ruling that housing regulation was a matter for the federal government, not the city. But during the period it was in force, rents in Berlin fell. When it was removed, they rose again. The experiment demonstrated both the effectiveness and the fragility of rent control as a tool. On algorithmic pricing, the legal cases are still unfolding. But the direction of travel is clear. The Department of Justice lawsuit against RealPage and the parallel state-level cases signal that regulators are beginning to treat algorithmic rent coordination as an antitrust violation. If the courts agree, the practice will either be prohibited or heavily regulated. That will not, by itself, bring rents down, but it will remove one of the most powerful mechanisms for coordinated rent inflation. On institutional ownership, several U.S. states have introduced or proposed legislation to restrict the ability of large investors to buy single-family homes. These proposals are controversial. Some economists argue they would reduce supply by discouraging investment in new construction. But the political momentum is real. In a country where homeownership has become a defining aspiration, the image of a private equity firm outbidding a young family at auction has proven to be politically toxic. On zoning, the most significant recent development is the movement to legalize density in single-family zones. Minneapolis became the first major American city to eliminate single-family zoning entirely in 2020. Oregon followed at the state level. New Zealand passed national legislation requiring cities to allow higher density near transit. These reforms are slow to produce results. It takes years for new housing to be built, but they represent a genuine shift in the political consensus around land use. On short-term rentals, cities from Amsterdam to Barcelona to New York have introduced restrictions on platforms like Airbnb. New York's Local Law 18, introduced in 2023, effectively banned most short-term rentals in the city by requiring hosts to be present and limiting guests to 2. Within months of the law taking effect, tens of thousands of short-term rental listings disappeared from the platform. Whether they returned to the long-term rental market is still being studied. But the supply shock was real. None of these interventions is sufficient on its own. What they share is a common logic: that housing is too important to be left entirely to the market, that the market, left to itself, will produce outcomes that are efficient for capital and catastrophic for people, and that the role of government is to set the rules under which the market operates, rules that reflect the public interest, not just the interest of investors. Let me close with the thing I most want you to take away from this. Rent is not rising because of some impersonal force of nature. It is not rising because of supply and demand in the abstract. It is rising because of specific decisions made by specific people and institutions, operating within specific rules that were written by specific governments. The algorithm that raised your rent was built by a company. The company was sued by the government. The tax break that made your landlord's investment so profitable was written into law by a legislature. The zoning code that prevents apartments from being built near your job was passed by a city council. The short-term rental platform that removed your neighbor's apartment from the market operates under rules set by regulators who could change them. Every part of this system is a human creation, and human creations can be changed. What you can do is simple, but it matters. Know your rights as a tenant. Keep records of your rent increases. Join a tenant union if one exists in your area. Attend your local planning meetings. Vote for politicians who treat housing as a public good rather than a private asset. And when you hear someone say that rent is rising simply because there aren't enough homes, ask them to explain the algorithm. Ask them to explain the tax depreciation rules. Ask them to explain why Vienna works. The paper trail is there. You just have to follow it. I'm grateful you spent this time with me. If this investigation was useful to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the Paper Trail for more investigations like this one. And if you have a story about rent, a landlord who used algorithmic pricing, an eviction that didn't add up, a neighborhood that changed overnight, get in touch. We are still following this trail. Thank you.